Researching and exploring this topic in depth was very important to me. My mom is Venezuelan, and so there's a part of me that belongs to that country and to all the ways it's been scarred. I knew on a very surface level the kind of suffering that people are facing there, but I wanted to know the why. I wanted to know what led to the downfall of such a beautiful place. And most importantly, I wanted to see what was being done to try to salvage and bring the country back to what it once was. The foundation of my working thesis never had to be changed. The article, Trump's Venezuela Moves Follow Long History of Intervention in Latin America by Kari Khan in NPR, was one of the more helpful articles I used, as it provided a great deal of evidence for my counter-argument. It explained a variety of failed U.S. military intervention attempts, while also following the decisions that Trump is currently making that seem to parallel mistakes made in the past, especially in Latin America. An interesting term that I discovered in my research was the whole idea of interim president. Leader of the legislature, Juan Guaido, is being recognized as a legitimate ruler by 50 nations after he self-proclaimed. He will assume all powers of the executive branch and stand as acting president. He was able to do this because under constitutional law, the National Assembly proclaimed Maduro as an usurper after his second election, and therefore the presidency is technically vacant. I believe that one of the most important things we as individuals can do is spread awareness and have conversations about these issues. It's rare to see Venezuela consistently appear on the news, and many people have no idea how truly severe the conditions are. It's important to understand this level of corruption so that it doesn't continue to happen. Aside from that, there are places you can go, such as the UN Refugee Agency, and donate to provide basic necessities to families. When I started writing this essay, I had a very structured layout of the way I wanted it to look and flow. What I did not account for was the abundance of questions and new ideas that came up throughout, things I needed to look up and research a little more into. It taught me the importance of really working hard at critically thinking about those potential questions before beginning to write.
Before I began my research, my assumption was military force, especially in the Middle East, has largely been a disaster for U.S. armed forces, and at a cost to taxpayers that's intolerable. With an expected price tag well over $3 trillion spent on the Iraq War, using force to resolve issues in the Middle East rarely goes to plan. However, given the unique set of circumstances occurring in Yemen, I believe that this would be an ideal situation to use American forces to genuinely do some good. Thus, my thesis went from being fairly against war to being something a war hawk would say. The source that was most helpful was the CIA's World Factbook. It has a succinct background description of the last 100 years in Yemen, and a summary of every basic issue occurring in the nation. I was originally looking for a State Department summary of the war in Yemen, but found a link to the CIA and was intrigued. So Francesca and I took contrasting opinions on how the U.S. should deal with the conflicts in Venezuela and Yemen respectively. My argument was largely based on the success of the first Gulf War and how the repelling of the invasion of Kuwait was largely a success. Given the similar near pan-Arab coalition, I figured a similar operation where the U.S. forms the bulk of ground forces for the initial quelling of hostilities between the Houthi forces and the legitimate government would be ideal. Following this, a UN peacekeeping force would be deployed, largely staffed by Saudis and other Gulf Cooperation Council members, to help rebuild and keep the peace. This keeps the U.S. from getting bogged down in another occupation, maintains the balance of power in the region, and allows for humanitarian aid to reach those who need it the most. History for my partner paints a largely different picture, especially under the Monroe Doctrine era of foreign policy, where the U.S. would come to a country every decade or so and quash any inclinations of action not in favor of American policy. A peaceful solution through economic means would result in a more stable Venezuela and less suffering from a U.S. invasion. It's important to note that a civil war has yet to occur in Venezuela and has been occurring for 3 long and bloody years in Yemen. This is the difference of escalating a conflict to war and resolving an ongoing war. The term Houthi was quite interesting, as it's derived from the initial leader of the Houthi movement, Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi. It kind of reminds me of how during the Roman Civil War, the factions were referred to as the Caesarians and the Pompeians. The Saudi-led coalition force of Gulf Cooperation Council members just doesn't have the same ring to it. We as individuals can help end some of the suffering in Yemen through a couple of means. You can support the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, better known as UNICEF. You can support charities that help asylum seekers resettle elsewhere, be it in the United States or other Arab countries. Speaking of supporting asylum seekers, write to Congress and remind them that it is illegal under international law to refuse asylum seekers, regardless of their country of origin. Also, don't spread cholera. Spreading disease is bad, y'all. In the future, I changed the way I approach this prompt in a couple of ways. Given my procrastinistic ways, I would start earlier. Before finals. I only really had one day to write this paper, and unfortunately, I think it shows. Also, I would pick a quote-unquote easier topic to write about. War is depressing, and it's hard to write about without being really depressed. Lastly, I would like to expand further upon how things might not go to plan if the US got involved. I think it fair to expand upon the contrasting arguments and give a more thorough explanation of how ending the Civil War is a worthy risk despite those misgivings.